Ladies and gentlemen, hello everyone. It is an honor, first and foremost, to participate and to contribute to the opening of the 2020 Zionist Congress. I know the gravity and the importance of this honor that has been bestowed upon me. I know what the Zionist Congress represents in the history of our people, in the structuring and preservation of the identity of our people. And I feel greatly honored. Therefore, I would like to thank you for this honor. To speak in the Zionist Congress that obviously conjures memories or some very moving sentiments. And of course, one cannot but think of the first Zionist Congress in history, the one in which that man of vision, that poet, that messianic persona appeared. The person who will be one of the greatest builders of the Jewish people, and that, of course, is Theodor Herzl. And he declared, as you all know, that if we, first of all, must determine the State of Israel's date of birth, and that date was actually in the Zionist Congress in Basel in 1897, because that was the bedrock of the State of Israel. That was when the State of Israel was first declared. And this is why this gathering today is so important as well, because it is the beautiful spirit that can be found in the background of all the deliberations, and not just Theodor Herzl. When we think about the Zionist Congress, I also think about the amazing diversity of inclinations, trends, opinions, philosophies, political philosophies, which were all manifest in the Zionist Congress. You know the history of this conference just as well as I do. You all know that some great people had spoken in this Congress. All kinds of people, different people. For example, Chaim Arlozorov, Max Nordau, for example, Martin Buber. So many great names from contemporary Jewish history, people that under different circumstances, some of them more dramatic in the 1930s, some quite glorious after World War II, for example, are gathering that decided to gather in Jerusalem, and which lit a torch between the people, the torch, the beacon of Jewish redemption. The Zionist Congress is all of these things together. It is Zionism, it is the metaphysical, political Zionism, and all the different shades of Zionism, whether it's the Zionism of the right or the left or the center or vice versa. It is the rally, the gathering of the Jewish people in all of its different shades and colors. And let me tell you, I am telling you this to show you how respected I feel with this honor you've bestowed on me today. And this year, in 2020, we are living through a time which is special, different, in a world that is flawed, a world which suffers. And of course, we cannot but ask ourselves everywhere, whether in Europe, in the East, and even in the United States, of that plague of the spirit, which is anti-Semitism, this pandemic called anti-Semitism, and its new contemporary language is the hatred of who we are, and what we represent here this morning. Anti-Zionism is the language of contemporary anti-Semitism. It is the way in which anti-Semitism, which has already exhausted all of its old ancient languages, which are disappearing and which have been extensively criticized. Well, anti-Semitism has abandoned all these old languages and has found a new language, and of course this poses an even greater responsibility upon us, because what this means is when we meet together today and as we defend Zionism this year, as we show Zionism's face, we're actually contributing to the activities against anti-Semitism and standing up to all these acts of anti-Semitism which are so popular in the world today. This Congress is important for yet another reason. That second reason is that tune which we hear everywhere, which reflects, which tells us that Zionism, it's as if it had lost its force, it's exhausted, perhaps seemingly it has fulfilled its historic mission, and it no longer has what to say to the younger Jewish generations today, or to other countries and other nations. But I do not agree with that. I think that Zionism is only at the beginning of its history, at the cusp of its history. I think about it as the movement of the liberation of the Jewish people. This national liberation movement managed to create this unique miracle in the 20th century, and Zionism definitely has what to say to us even today. And this is what I wanted to mention today. Israel is such a young nation, country. On the one hand, of course, it's ancient, just as the history of the world is as ancient as the history of the world, yet it is also so young and can resist all the turmoils of history. And what we call Zionism today, this compilation of thought which gathers us together here today, must continue to put in its spirit as long as we are alive. Let us not accept this dream that Zionism has reached the end of its road, that it has exhausted its message. I think that is completely untrue, and I'm saying this because I have a very deep conviction that that is the truth, and this is why I had asked your permission to speak here today. And there is one more thing that makes this invitation such a great honor for me, but of course I would never even consider not complying, because this Zionist Congress almost did not take place, just like all the other Zionist Congresses since the end of World War II. It was supposed to be held in Jerusalem. But these health emergency conditions which exist in Israel, just as it does all over the world, and in Europe, you know, the countries which are your countries of origin, in Europe and in other places, it is because of them that it almost could not take place at all, this Congress, and definitely it did not take place in Jerusalem. The Congress had to take place, and therefore the importance of this virtual Congress, I am not hiding or concealing this from you. Perhaps some of you are familiar with the discomfort that this climate causes for me, this climate of fear, apprehension, sometimes even madness that this pandemic has brought to people. So this state, the distance, the speaking over the internet through various means of communications and media, Judaism is so closely related and connected to direct talk, to exchanges between teachers and students, exchanges between study partners, between members of a chavruta, you know, the people who study the same text, the same interpretation. All that is deeply rooted in Jewish existence and in Jewish practice. Therefore, there's something quite strange when we speak with each other in such a way. And, of course, I'm not talking about Judaism that perhaps is not about studying, but rather about the practice of fulfilling the moral duties between individuals. Judaism, as our teacher, Emmanuel Levinas, said, and he talked about nourishing the hungry, giving water to the thirsty, etc. Giving to others, which doesn't always align with this distance and remoteness and the walls imposed by this pandemic. Yet this is another reason why we should be here. This is yet another reason why we mustn't accept the situation that the Jewish Congress will not take place. We don't want it to be a victim of this pandemic, yet another victim, because men, women, people die, but ideas might also die. That happens when ideas are not implemented, when they are not experienced, they might also die. And this is one of the reasons why this encounter here today, why this session is so important. Now I would like to move on to the heart of our topic this morning, and excuse me for the long introductory comments. Now I would like to say to you, ladies and gentlemen, but I'm not just speaking to the people who are listening to this. I am talking to young Jews worldwide today. And I would like to tell you how my generation experienced and continues to experience the Zionist adventure. First of all, I belong to that Jewish tradition for which the diaspora, the exile, living in the diaspora, cosmopolitan values are a part of our lives. That's what I always thought. I always thought that the diaspora, it is not some kind of a remainder, a remnant, something that was cast away, but history. Rather, on the contrary, I thought that this is something that should be integrated quickly into the mainstream of Zionism. And I would like to tell you that when I was a younger man, and then later on as I grew up, I always thought that Jewish existence actually functions in two layers, in two spheres, or rather in two languages. And this argument, I didn't always accept it. I also think that from the depth of our history, from the depth of our texts, from the depth of the message of the Bible, you have this idea that the Jewish people is a people that was designated to return to its land, but it is also a people, just like HaKadosh Baruch Hu said, as he said that to our forefathers, and this was also said to Moses during the Exodus, a nation that is like the sand in the sea. So this concept of a nation like sand. It is a people of the land, but also a people of the sand on the beach. As it was said to our forefathers, and as Moses said, it is one nation, one people, a nation, a people that can be compared to the sand in the sea. And this concept is a very basic concept in Judaism. And what it means is that being a Jew is something that is part of universal history, the history of the nations, and it has a very unique place because we're not talking only about yet another nation. I truly believe from the bottom of my heart that there is something in the Jewish people. It has something to say. It has a role to fulfill in the redemption of its people, of our own people, but also of other people, of other nations. I truly and wholeheartedly believe that the Jew is a treasure for the other nations which do not recognize it, and that it remains a treasure in any case. It remains an angel of salvation for other nations, whether they want it or not, in their own redemption. And I believe in all these things. I believe that in life in diaspora or in exile, I think that Jewish existence of a Jew, let's say a Romanian Jew, an Italian Jew, an American Jew, a French Jew, I think that there is something very noble in the existence of these Jews, something that cannot be reduced to some kind of a unique expectation to going to Jerusalem. And I'm telling you this in order to be frank and open. I want to speak in the most sincere and honest way I know. I don't think that existence in the diaspora or in exile is somehow second rate, is somehow less than. I do not think that this is an existence which is completely free of responsibility, of moral commitments, and yet I cannot but remember, and I feel that I must also mention here today in my address here, and like I said, I am so moved by the fact that I have this privilege and honor to speak here. I must repeat what Theodor Herzl said. I must remember what 53 years ago was my first experience with the land of Israel. In June of 1967, the day after the Six-Day War, the spiritual, philosophical, and physical shock which I had experienced when encountering this country and its land. I have spoken about this elsewhere as well. I remember visiting Ben Gurion in the Negev. I remember the roads. I remember the crossing points through mountain peaks and hilltops, which seemed to be carved by the finger of God. I remember how much at awe I was from the beauty of nature and this feeling that this nature was given to humans, and the Jewish human beings in this case, for them to experience this nature, this landscape, and enrich it with its wisdom. I remember my excitement as I saw these sights, which I hadn't known, but just like the poet says, they spoke to my soul. A Jew who is proud of his Judaism, a positive Jew, as I consider myself to be, and I think that's what I've always been. This first discovery of Israel and then when rediscovering Israel, because every visit to Jerusalem has a little bit of that shock in the layers of wisdom, intelligence, thought, poetry. And I remember, like I said earlier, one of the forefathers of the State of Israel, one of the founders of Israel, was perhaps a good politician, but mainly we didn't only have politicians, we also had poets, people with a poetic spirit. And today in Israel, I think that the Zionist spirit continues to beat, and that poetic inspiration never died out. On the contrary, so this shock by the pilgrimage to Jerusalem, the shock that came along when encountering the stones and rocks of Jerusalem, the sand of the desert, the sand, I mean in the physical sense. I belong to a generation which at a very early stage understood, I was perhaps 20 in 1968. That means, so in 1968, that means one generation after the liberation of the death camps. And I remember that when people talked about the extermination of the Jewish people, and I belong to that generation. When I was 20 years old, I was very close to that scene from hell. And I belong to a generation that saw very quickly in the existence of the State of Israel, in Israel's empowerment, in the way Israel was defended. I consider it to be a guarantee, an existential guarantee for all the Jews in the world. And that impressed me ever so much. And it has always impressed me and still does. There are all kinds of Jews, and there are Jews amongst us who do not love Israel. There are Jews who, for various reasons, and I do not wish to explore these reasons right now, who do not identify themselves with the truth of Israel. I had always been impressed by the fact that this moment always comes, this moment in the lives of these Jews, the Jews who they felt kind of distant, but ultimately the moment would always come, the moment in which they discover that for them as well, Israel is this secret point that they can lean on, some kind of a guide, a Sherpa, whom they refused to recognize until that moment. And they thought that they had nothing to do with the return of the Jews to Zion. And then they understood that Israel is what makes it possible for them to stand upright, proud, and to no longer be doomed to that regime of such a disliked people as their forefathers were. And it wasn't that long in history when that was the case. And I believe, and this is something I've believed from a young age, and I still believe so today. I never thought thinking that Israel, which speaks to our soul, is also a shelter, a country providing shelter to all the Jews in the world. Whenever in the history of the Jewish people, in the Jewish sensitivity, whenever something, this fear erodes us, the fear of the pogroms, of persecution, whenever that recurs, whether we want it or not, in the backs of our minds, this star shines. Maybe not the star of redemption, but that of salvation to the soul, to Jewish wisdom, which is the option to return to Israel. There is no one Jew in the world, and even if that Jew, as deaf as that Jew could be to the words of Moses, Moshe Rabbeinu, as if he seals his ears and doesn't listen to Herzl and Chaim Weizmann, and yet I believe that every Jew, if that Jew accepts this even very minor belonging to this people, to this nation, must experience this. When the dark, threatening persecutions, when they return, as Emmanuel Levinas said, when we hear again the howls of those jackals of anti-Semitism, when we hear these voices again, the thought always resurges, the thought that there is one place in the world, one country, one land, one state that is called the land of Israel, and thanks to that country, the persecution can no longer annihilate these people, and it gives us weapons that help us fight that persecution. We fight better when we know that we have a shelter, that we have a solution. We fight better, and we know how to defend Judaism and the Jewish people when we know, when we feel deep inside, as we put on ourselves that armor from within, which is that certainty that there is this place in the world where that rock, that steadfast rock, stands. And we always fight better whenever it is necessary, when we know that we have that rock, and not like what happened in Masada, when we were pushed to the wall, pushed to take desperate measures today in the US, in Eastern Europe, in Western Europe, in the Far East, everywhere. Jews feel encouraged. They feel filled with courage as they face their daily assignments, whether political or others, and all that is thanks to the mere fact that the state of Israel is somewhere out there, that it exists, that it can contribute to this bedrock, to this foundation of their existence. And of course, for Israel to fulfill this role, for Israel to be able to fulfill its role among the nations, for Israel to be able to fulfill its role in the imaginary role we each have, for Israel to see that shining star to all the Jewish communities which you represent. For that, we need Israel to be Israel. What I mean is that Israel must be loyal to itself. Israel must be loyal to the values which had been a part of it since its creation. And Israel must not only be a country just like any other country. Israel must not be yet another ordinary country, not one of the Hegelian countries in which the people one day discover their truth. No, I think that for Israel to be loyal to its mission, to its purpose, Israel has to be something which is a bit different. And Israel, which is a country that is so filled with joie de vivre, shall continue with passion, shall continue to be a role model. And I believe in Zionism. I am so delighted to speak here today because I believe that Israel is an exemplary country, mainly because I wish for it to continue to be such a country, an exemplary country, a role model, because when we think about it, this project, a society that is made up of people from such different origins, or as they say in the US, this project, which is so difficult in other places, which is so painful in other places, there is one place in which this experiences and lives from day one, and that is Israel, which is a society that has so many sectors and elements. You have men and women who came from Europe, from America, from the West, from the East, from Arab countries, from Latin America, from so many places. What a brilliant example. We could not find a more brilliant example to see how this connection was created between the people coming from all these places, and the existence of the State of Israel is proof of that. The State of Israel is a wonderful country. It's an exemplary country from its inception. And the reason is that the State of Israel brought an answer to the first question that political philosophy, both Western and Jewish political philosophy, poses. Even before Western thinking, and that means how to create a nation. How can a social contract be created? That is a question that for a long time seemed to be a theoretical one with legendary mythological answers. The question is, how do you create a contract? Is this something that evolves over the centuries? What needs to sink in for this situation to be created? Until the existence of the State of Israel, until the creation of the State of Israel, people thought that a nation is forged slowly, painfully, over centuries, and it requires time, blood, sweat, and tears. But there's one thing that the West was convinced of, that a nation is not created overnight, and the idea of Rousseau's social contract, maybe it sounds imaginary, but Israel is the only example. I'm not familiar of any other example. Israel is the only example for the convening of men and women who have come, like I said, from all corners of the earth, and many of them never experienced democracy, and those who experienced the Nazi horrors, those who came from Russia, those who came from the Arab countries. And Israel is an example for how those men and women coming from such different places, from such different political platforms, overnight, with this kind of declaration, which we hesitate to say whether it was a human or divine declaration, formed a democracy. That is the example. That is why Israel is a role model. This amazing democracy, this democracy which was simply born from one minute to the next, overnight. I do not know of any other examples for such a thing in history, definitely not in the past 100 years. And the way in which Israel, despite the more or less constant state of warfare that was forced upon it until not so long ago, until recently, by all of its neighbors, how did the State of Israel know to maintain and preserve the laws that it determined upon its foundation? I do not know of any other democratic regimes that under similar circumstances would not more or less succumb, maybe some more, some less, to these emergency situations, to these alarms of the states of emergency, who would not give in to the easy solutions of setting aside the democratic values for a certain period at least, or that concern for the Republican regime. But Israel did that for its own sake, but for others as well, because as we've heard, and as I've already said, the country was invented by people who believe in history, people who believe, people with this very deep sense of messianism, a deep faith in history, because Israel is actually an outcome of all these things. And this is why it makes Israel such a role model. And by its mere existence, Israel is something that eludes, escapes the structure of all the other nations. And there is one thing: the fact that Israel is so exceptional, it is essential. It is essential for Israel, so that the Jews who live in Israel today, all those who intend to make Aliyah, and all those who keep and cherish it in their hearts, in their souls, in their spirit, who cherish this idea that their lives can only be complete when they come to Jerusalem. All those who are willing to renew their soul, as André Neher said, or who can see far into the future and feel on their body, on their flesh, the power of this experience. For all those, it is essential that Israel remains such a role model nation, a bit different than other countries, other nations, and it must avoid this traditional classification of the Hegelian countries that I had already mentioned. Hopefully, Israel will be able to remain loyal to this situation. Hopefully, Israel will be able to continue to plow in that same path of democracy, because I am convinced that this is a basic element of the ideal that has brought us all together here today. Ladies and gentlemen, distinguished delegates, thank you very much, and hope to see you all soon in Jerusalem.
Merci et à bientôt à Jérusalem.